In 1986, when I was coming of age, Ronald Reagan doubled down on the war on drugs that had been started by Richard Nixon in 1971. Drugs were bad, fried your brain, and drug dealers were monsters, the sole reason neighborhoods and major cities were failing. No one wanted to talk about Reaganomics and the ending of social safety nets, the defunding of schools and the loss of jobs in cities across America. Young men like me who hustled became the sole villain, and drug addicts lacked moral fortitude. In the 1990s, incarceration rates in the U.S. blew up. Today, we imprison more people than any other country in the world. China, Russia, Iran, Cuba. All countries we consider autocratic and repressive. Yeah, more than them. Judges' hands were tied by tough on crime laws, and they were forced to hand out mandatory life sentences for simple possession and low-level drug sales. My home state of New York started this with Rockefeller laws. Then the feds made distinctions between people who sold powder cocaine and crack cocaine, even though they were the same drug. Only difference is how you take it. And even though white people used and sold crack more than black people, somehow it was black people who went to prison. The media ignored actual data to this day. Crack is still talked about as a black problem. The NYPD raided our Brooklyn neighborhoods while Manhattan bankers openly used coke with impunity. The war on drugs exploded the U.S. prison population, disproportionately locking away black and Latinos. Our prison population grew more than 900%. When the war on drugs began in 1971, our prison population was 200,000. Today it is over 2 million. Long after the crack era ended, we continued our war on drugs. There were more than 1.5 million drug arrests in 2014. More than 80% were for possession only. Almost half were for marijuana. People are finally talking about treating addiction to harder drugs as a health crisis, but there's no compassionate language about drug dealers. Unless, of course, we're talking about places like Colorado, whose state economy got a huge boost by the above-ground marijuana industry. A few states south in Louisiana, they're still handing out mandatory sentences for people who sell weed. Despite a booming and celebrated $50 billion legal marijuana industry, most states still disproportionately hand out mandatory sentences to black and Latinos with drug cases. If you're entrepreneurial and live in one of the many states that are passing legalized laws, you may still face barriers participating in the above-ground economy. Venture capitalists migrate to these states to open multi-billion-dollar operations, but former felons can't open a dispensary. Lots of times those felonies were drug charges, caught by poor people who sold drugs for a living, but are now prohibited from participating in one of the fastest-growing economies. Got it? In states like New York, where holding marijuana is no longer grounds for arrest, police issue possession citations in black and Latino neighborhoods at a far higher rate than other neighborhoods. Kids in Crown Heights are constantly stopped and ticketed for trees. Kids at dorms in Columbia, where rates of marijuana use are equal to or worse than those in the hood, are never targeted or ticketed. Rates of drug use are as high as they were when Nixon declared this so-called war in 1971. 45 years later, it's time to rethink our policies and laws. The war on drugs is an epic fail.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you, Jay-Z. Happy birthday, Willie Nelson. On this panel, we are going to cover the racist and political history behind cannabis's classification as a Schedule I drug and why it's important to reverse the wrongs by descheduling cannabis, ideally in 2021. I'm going to start with some introductions. I'm going to call on each panelist, but I'm going to ask them to please introduce themselves, talk briefly about how long they've been in the cannabis industry, what roles they've held, how they got into the cannabis industry, and how they personally feel about prohibition. Let's start with my friend Khurshid Khoja.
Thanks, Andrew. Happy to be here. My name is Khurshid Khoja. I'm the principal and founder of Greenbridge Corporate Counsel. We are a cannabis law boutique in California. We focus on transactional regulatory advice and we serve clients all the way from mom and pop businesses, social equity businesses, all the way through large publicly traded MSOs as well. In terms of how long I've been practicing in the industry as an attorney for, this is my 10th year of practice. I've held a lot of different roles in that time. I am a serial glutton for punishment, so I do enjoy trade association activism. I've served on various boards, the Minority Cannabis Business Association, the California Cannabis Industry Association. Currently, I serve as the chair of the board of the National Cannabis Industry Association, which is the oldest and largest trade association for legal cannabis businesses in the U.S. Why I got into the cannabis industry? So I got really interested in cannabis industry and the cannabis legalization movement out of law school after taking a drug law seminar, actually a seminar on the war on drugs, and learning about the civil rights impacts of cannabis prohibition. So that motivated me. My roots as an activist, as a youth activist. I share this in common with another one of our panelists, Betty Aldworth, as a youth activist in the international anti-apartheid movement. And so one of the facts I like to tell folks is that we imprisoned more black men in America for cannabis than apartheid era South Africa did during an armed insurgency. That tells you a little bit about the underpinnings of the drug war. How I feel about prohibition, I'm against all drug prohibition, not just cannabis, but all drugs. I think it's a health issue, and we need to stop criminalizing drugs. So thank you for having me.
Thanks, Khurshid. Next up is Paloma. The industry is getting normalized when medical doctors are supporting legalization. So Paloma, tell us about how you got involved.
Always, always. Thanks, Andrew, and thanks for having me on this panel. What an amazing panel. Unfortunately, it's not called "Why Was This Plant Illegal?" because it still remains federally illegal and on Schedule 1 today. My name is Dr. Paloma Leifelt. I'm a physician by training, neuroscience by career prior to entering cannabis. I've been in the industry now for about 3 years, but I really consider myself to be a lifelong cannabis student. I wrote my undergraduate thesis on delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, much to the chagrin of my neuroscience professor, but I've always really supplemented my education learning about cannabis. And being in the cannabis industry as a physician, you can't just be a medical professional. You have to be an advocate, you have to be a regulator, and you have to be a policymaker because of the incredibly racialized history of this plant. We'll talk about it a little later, but it's incredibly imperative that we really bring this back into every single healthcare provider's toolkit. We are facing an opioid epidemic, and that's really just the tip of the iceberg. And I'm currently the director of medical education at Vireo Health, which is a physician-led and science-driven medical cannabis company. We have a robust research portfolio really trying to fill in those gaps. 2 clinical trials on chronic pain based on opioid reduction that we run out of our dispensaries in New York State. And I am vehemently opposed to prohibition of all drugs, the same way Khurshid is. We're really doing patients across the country a disservice to not have this available to everyone. So looking forward to discussing this further today.
Thanks, Doc, and thank you, Vireo Health, for putting physicians front and center because this is a medicine. Betty is a legend in the cannabis industry, probably needs no introduction, but for those of you who don't know Betty, here we go.
Thanks, Andrew. That's really kind. Hi, everyone. I'm Betty Aldworth. I got my start in cannabis advocacy in 2009 when I was not a cannabis user myself any longer. I had found that I had an intense anxiety reaction to the cannabis that was available at the time in the informal economy, what some people might have called the illegal market, but what is, and I'll make it the case for this in a little bit, in fact, just an informal economy that is untaxed, but absolutely as established as any other. in that economy, I wasn't able to acquire tested, regulated cannabis, and wasn't able to use it either for my personal pleasure, my intellectual pursuits, or for control of my chronic pain. But I did see an amazing opportunity to help other people who needed to know more about the cannabis they were consuming. And I started out in the nation's first independent cannabis testing lab in Colorado. Jump a few years later, I was invited to be the spokesperson and advocacy director for Colorado's Amendment 64 initiative, which many of you will know is the very first to legalize cannabis in the nation for adult use. Washington followed just a few hours later that night. After the initiative, I was able to help shape the narrative for the emerging cannabis industry, still as an advocate though, when I joined the National Cannabis Industry Association as its third employee, along with our dear and recently departed friend, Steve Fox, who we should all take a moment to thank because he is the architect of so much of this policy reform that we benefit from now today. At NCIA, I was able to help folks understand what an emerging cannabis market might look like for legal use, for medical use, and to ensure that we were holding on to the importance of that medical use when we were talking about the coming legal market as well. I then spent the next 7 years as executive director of Students for Sensible Drug Policy, a global organization of young people dedicated to ending the public health, criminal justice, social, and economic absolute disaster that is the war on drugs. And I was able to learn that what I knew about cannabis and what I knew about other substances was just what I knew about cannabis prior to joining the cannabis advocacy movement, and what I knew about other drugs prior to joining the drug policy reform movement. All of those things were just based in fear. They weren't based in fact. They weren't based in science. They weren't based in any sort of understanding of the ways that people build their relationships with the substances that they consume, whether that be caffeine, nicotine, sugar, all drugs, or these illegal drugs that we choose to vilify because it's a convenient way to dismiss people with whom we disagree, who we would like to hold power over, who we feel ought to hold lower places in society, in our economic systems, whatever it may be. So I learned that the drug war is an enormous human rights failure and became incredibly dedicated to undoing it. Today, I have the pleasure of working for the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, where we are taking a science-based approach to rationalizing our relationships with psychedelics and cannabis for medical, spiritual, personal, or wellness use. And through that work, through proving the science, we're able to actually put the lie to the Controlled Substances Act, to what we believe, what we've always believed in terms of how drugs are affecting us, and to see not only have we locked up and destroyed the lives of millions through this terrible war on drugs, we've also prevented people, we've robbed people of their chance to heal, whether that be through cannabis for chronic conditions, whether that be through the use of psychedelics in a therapeutic experience or a wellness experience in order to overcome serious mental health conditions that are currently under investigation. So we've got an amazing opportunity right now to rethink the way that we think about drugs and the people who use them, our relationships with them, and how we position them in society. And in so doing, we are obligated to address the harms that were caused, particularly to communities of color and people of low income or the otherwise oppressed in society. The tentacles of the drug war are very, very, very long and very convoluted. But with the dedicated action of folks like my colleagues on this panel and the thousands and thousands and thousands of activists around the country, we're really starting to make a change. And it's a tremendously exciting time.
Thanks, Betty. Appreciate that. Last but not least, John. My fault that John's not going to have a pretty banner below him because I met him just about a week ago. We were speaking on a panel together, and I thought he was going to be an imperative to add to this panel, particularly given that we're talking about history, and he's a law professor. You always need a professor when you're talking about history. So, John, take it away.
Hi, everyone. I am John Heredia. I'm based out of San Francisco. And to be really real, as far as how long I've been in the industry, we could go back to the 90s when I was involved in the, you would say, illegal economy. But even dating back to that time, I looked at cannabis as a product that could help people. So I've held that to this very day. But on the legal side, I've been in the space since 2014. I own dispensaries in San Francisco and in Silicon Valley, as well as a cultivation and distribution facility in Sacramento. For these facilities, I currently serve as the chief legal officer and director of business development. And when I'm not doing that, I'm also a professor of cannabis law at Golden Gate University in San Francisco. Prior to entering the industry, I practiced as an entertainment lawyer in New York City and represented streetwear companies and musicians like Wu-Tang Clan and Currency. And now in the cannabis space, my efforts are trying to bring that lifestyle, that culture into the space. So in a nutshell, I'm someone from the traditional cannabis market who worked in the fashion, music, and legal industries while weed was still illegal. And when weed became legal, I parlayed my experience in fashion, music, and law into the cannabis industry. One unifying factor with all of that experience is that I have a social justice lean. So everything that I do is meant to uplift and empower people and communities that have been disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs. So I make it a point to work with folks who have been convicted of cannabis crimes, and I help them negotiate with investors and, big Wall Street bankers to really see how they could have generational wealth and ownership in the space. Like everyone, I am against all prohibition. And thank you for having me.
Thanks, Professor. Yeah, I've moderated quite a few panels during the course of my time in cannabis, but I would say this is by far the most powerhouse panel. I'm Andrew Klein. I'm a special counsel at Perkins Coie in our cannabis practice. Prior to Perkins Coie, I led public policy for the National Cannabis Industry Association and also worked for a cannabis startup. I'm relatively new to the industry, having been in the cannabis industry for about 4 years. We're going to start with a history lesson on the racist and political history behind cannabis classification as a Schedule I drug. And I'm going to ask Khurshid to start by explaining sort of just how we got here historically. Why is this plant illegal? How did this even happen?
Sure. So, first off, the video that we aired at the beginning is a great kind of summary of the modern war on drugs, right? But the war on cannabis and the war on drugs, goes back a lot further in time. Even before federal criminal laws against cannabis and other drugs, you had state level action, right? And so cannabis was prohibited at the state level in California, for example, where I am, in 1913, and it was really kind of it was through legislation prompted by the Board of Pharmacy, but of course there were some very racist underpinnings, racist and xenophobic underpinnings for wanting to push that policy, that law, right? And primarily it was directed at South Asian immigrants. There were references to the Hindu populations, right? Meaning really that was meant to refer to the Sikh and Punjabi population that was emigrating to the U.S. and emigrating to California for agricultural and other jobs. And so, the first impetus for prohibition in California was, to target undesirables, right? People who look like me in the state. And so, as we move further, and that was again 1913. And, you know, drug prohibition in California goes back to anti-Chinese legislation in the 1870s as well. But in terms of cannabis, as we go further east, you know, the rationale changes slightly for cannabis prohibition, and it changes. It matches the complexion of the folks who are in the underclasses in those parts of the country. And so in the Southwest, you know, you see cannabis prohibition in New Mexico and Texas, with the wave of Mexican laborers coming up looking for work, and you see cannabis prohibition spread throughout the Western U.S. as these populations are spreading. Not that they actually had, you know, highly disproportionate rates of usage, or that it was common, but it was common to refer to the Mexican weed, right, and to really kind of play up the association with these migrating communities. And, you know, in California, it was referred to as Indian hemp before they called it marijuana, right? So there's always been sort of this underpinning of all these cannabis prohibition laws. The real sort of purpose, and maybe not the sole purpose, but the primary purpose seemed to be to control populations of folks that were deemed undesirable, right? And so from that basis, you kind of again spread east, and then you see cannabis laws essentially targeting African American populations as cannabis, you know, comes through the ports, right? So in every instance, though, this sort of, you know, why we need to prohibit cannabis. Well, because it's tied to this community of color or that community of color, folks that, you know, we don't want as part of our society, right? And so that's been very sort of common underpinning of cannabis prohibition at the state level. You know, one thing I'll note, since we're talking about Texas at this conference, you know, unfortunately, El Paso had the distinction of being the first city in the U.S. to pass cannabis prohibition in 1914. In any case, you know, all these state efforts led eventually to federal prohibition. The first move to prohibit cannabis at the federal level in 1937 with the Marijuana Tax Stamp Act. You know, and you see the development of international anti-drug legislation through various international conventions, and that eventually led to the passage of the Controlled Substances Act. So I think Betty is a fantastic authority on the modern history of the drug war. So I think I will ask her to talk about this next leg of the history of cannabis prohibition.
Oh, you, Betty.
Thanks. So in the 1970s, President Richard Nixon decided to really ramp things up. And there's some debate about whether or not he actually said, you can't arrest blacks and hippies for being blacks and hippies, but you can arrest them for their drugs. And that was the impetus for launching the drug war. We're not sure if he said it, but here's the thing. We're all pretty sure he might have, because we know that the drug war was built around the idea of othering people, of creating excuses to criminalize people who were undesirable, who were agitating for social change, who were trying to build their own collective liberation at that time, and who still so often are trying to do that same thing today, and still so often are coming up against these same laws, whether that be in political action movements, whether that be in community justice movements. We see all sorts of laws making certain activities illegal. Like, for example, when you have to get a permit for a march, there are very specific activities that are meant to curb dissent, right? And this is one of them. And hey, convenient enough, it also allows you to target certain communities because of what they like to put in their bodies. And then you can start to tear those communities apart from the inside by removing people from them. What we see, particularly in urban Black communities in the 70s, 80s, 90s, is an incredible movement from community to prison, from school to prison, where we see the criminalization of children at school. In fact, We see children as young as 8 being enlisted as confidential informants to inform against their own family members. We see extraordinary manipulation of those communities, very heavy policing as compared to other communities. And you've probably all heard it before, right? People, regardless of the color of their skin, tend to use drugs at about the same rates. But Black and brown people in America are arrested sometimes as much as 8 times more often for those crimes. Now, once you get into that system, it's really hard to get out. And, you know, if we were conspiratorial about it, we might say that's on purpose. I certainly do. There are so many ways in which the drug laws undermine communities and create a lack of employment opportunity, a lack of educational opportunity, a lack of housing when you can't actually live in government-funded housing if you have a drug conviction. So if your wife and children are living there when you come out of prison, where do you go? You can't go home. You can't be a father. If you're, you know, the ways in which the drug war has torn apart communities systemically, that's the thing, systematized destruction of community and family in order to tamp down dissent, maintain power in the hands of those who hold it, and ensure that we can use fear, like call to the person's lizard brain and teach them all of the scary things about these substances when they're young, so that when you recite these words later, they're just going to go along with whatever it was you said. Listen, here's the thing. Nobody's ever died of a cannabis overdose. Nobody's ever died of overdose from most illegal substances. Opioids, of course, being a probably systematized version of that. In fact, systematized version of that too. Let's just say it for what it is, right? All drugs, all substances, all activities carry risk, and we have the opportunity to address those risks head on, acknowledge the fact that everybody uses drugs, right? That every culture in the history of the world has used substances to alter their brain chemistry. Little children spin around in circles because it makes them feel like fun and high, right? And maybe it's a little bit like that cannabis buzz that you get when you're an adult and you can make a reasoned decision about whether or not that's a risk you want to take. But we're not giving people proper education, and instead are creating fear amongst people who don't use drugs of people who do, allowing us to other them and decide that it's okay to lock them up in cells for decades at a time, decades, simply for the fact of using or sharing drugs with their friends. And that action, that is what ought to be a crime. It ought to be a crime that we treat people like this, but we do. And so over the course of the last 50 years, what we have seen, as I've just gone on about a lot, is the dismantling of community, the dismantling of family, the dismantling of opportunity, combined with extraordinary incarceration rates for Black and brown men. And then, as we saw in that video, an explicit exclusion from an emerging market in which expertise might be extremely valuable, don't you think? I mean, how many times, for the cannabis consumers out there, how many times have you walked in and had a bud tender who knows a lot less than you do tell you all about how smart they are, right? And bless them, but like, we know what we're talking about, right? So this recent history still contributes to the othering that we do, particularly of people who use stigmatized drugs like opioids and methamphetamine, who are just as entitled to tomorrow as the rest of us are.
I think that quote, "That ought to be a crime," is really apt, and we need to publish and promote that quote, because I totally agree. Paloma, you must have a unique perspective as a medical doctor. You know, I've talked about this openly. My brother died of an alcohol overdose, and to Betty's point, I've never met anyone who has ever met or known anyone who's ever died of a cannabis overdose. It just doesn't exist. What's your perspective on why this happened, how this happened, where we are?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Betty. To quote the great Bill Murray, the most dangerous part of the plant is getting caught with it. And that's absolutely true. And I mentioned in my intro that you have to be a policymaker, a scientist, but you also have to be a historian to really understand why this isn't available to Americans, why this is a Schedule I substance. And we have to go back to 1850, prior to the systemic racism and the so-called war on drugs, where in the United States, cannabis was listed in the United States Pharmacopoeia, which is the healthcare practitioner's Bible for what medicines to give what patients. It was listed for having indications for leprosy, sexual dysfunction, opiate addiction, many of the same qualifying conditions what cannabis is today in the United States. So this has been over a century-long battle that we've been experiencing. A lot of my colleagues from medical school don't understand the fact that this is really an amazing either alternative therapy as well as an adjunct for many of common pharmaceutical treatments today. Name another single pharmacological agent that really is able to treat a bevy of different medical conditions, from mental health issues to chronic pain, which is another epidemic in our country, to sexual dysfunction, just to name a few. I mean, we can sit here and list it. The only thing that's really equatable to it is an aspirin, something that has a couple indications, but compare that to cannabis, which is really a plant of over 1,001 medicines with all the minor and major cannabinoids. Talk about chronic pain in our country. Talk about polypharmacy in our country. Talk about the mental health epidemic now with the COVID pandemic. 1 in 5 individuals that had the coronavirus now have a new onset mental illness. We talk about the treatments that are available to people in the United States, SSRIs, which come with its own bevy of side effects, as well as its own discontinuation syndrome. Talk about oral opiates, which are Schedule II on the Controlled Substance Act that kill over 150 Americans every day. And then compare it to alcohol and tobacco. I mean, alcohol kills over 50,000 Americans every year, and tobacco over 450,000. So when we talk about cannabis as a really viable solution to a lot of these epidemics that are really plaguing United States citizens, especially our elderly, which is our largest growing demographic here, it's a no-brainer that we should bring this back into the U.S. Pharmacopoeia, bring this back into all healthcare practitioners' toolkits. Only 13% of United States medical schools teach about cannabis as a medicine. I graduated from medical school fairly recently, and it was taught in the same lecture as drugs of abuse like cocaine and methamphetamine, which have no business being in the same lecture, much less the same category on the Controlled Substance Act. So it's so important that we really deschedule rather than reschedule this, 100 years ago.
Thanks, Paloma. Really appreciate that perspective. John, I'm going to ask you to take off your current dispensary owner hat and your current law professor hat and put on your old hat, which was as an entertainment lawyer, and just talk a little bit. And this is going to be the last piece that we'll talk about in terms of the history, and then we'll get into what's happening today. But just some history on musicians back east and how cannabis affected them.
Thanks,
Cannabis
Andrew.
prohibition.
Thank you. And I think to really get a good crux of how cannabis prohibition impacted entertainment and music, I want to focus on jazz and jazz musicians in the South and the pressures that they faced. So I believe that cannabis prohibition singularly rests on an individual named Harry Anslinger. He was a powerful mid-century bureaucrat. He was a racist, and he had an all-consuming hatred of jazz that really fueled the beginning of our country's anti-cannabis crusade. And to tackle your question fully, I think it's important to provide a bit of a historical context regarding the interplay between jazz in the South and cannabis. And I'm going to go ahead and put back my professor hat for a little bit, but stick with the entertainment line, but I'll try to keep it short. So around the end of World War I, sailors and Caribbean immigrants started to introduce cannabis to increasingly enfranchise Black communities in New Orleans and other southern port cities. And remember, this was the era of Prohibition, and cannabis was cheaper and much more easily accessible than booze was. Cannabis quickly became popular amongst these southern Black communities whose growing economic, cultural, and electoral power was simultaneously threatening to upend the region's racially stratified social order. Parallel to the increased use of cannabis in these communities, jazz music largely moved to port cities like New Orleans and Biloxi. Jazz band members who were too poor to afford liquor naturally gravitated towards cannabis, courtesy of those Caribbean immigrants who worked in those docks. And as we all know, that John started to gain popularity outside of the African American community, and white folks started to pay attention and really love the music. And now bringing it back to Ainslinger, he hated jazz. Or rather, he didn't hate jazz so much as he hated what it seemed to signal about the future of American society. So by the time the 18th Amendment rolled around, jazz's expanded reach saw Black jazz musicians playing in speakeasies and social clubs in Prohibition era Chicago, Detroit, and New York. And to Ainslinger's great horror, they performed for mixed audiences, socialites, movie stars, recent immigrants, and guess who else? Young white women. So after work, these Black men would head back to Harlem or the south side of Chicago, flush with cash, grass, and disregard for the country's racial caste system. The bigoted individuals like Ainslinger, folks like Louis Armstrong, were a threat to the public order. Jazz's popularity and very existence was pretty much a testament to the societal shifts that Ainslinger and his fellow racists feared. So to preserve his position, Ainslinger realized he need to give the American public a good reason to resist these changing demographics. And someone, something would have to be held responsible. And so hence shortly after, we see reefer madness and the nationwide efforts by bureaucrats who were in cahoots with major publishing companies to stigmatize and criminalize cannabis. All of these efforts utilized overt racist tactics such as claims that African Americans would lure white women with jazz and marijuana. So that's my 2 cents as to how Prohibition impacted jazz. And I really recommend the movie U.S. versus Billie Holiday. It's out now, and it really provides a really good visual representation of what I just said.
Thanks, John. Khursheed, you know, we've played witness to racism in this country. You and I have talked about this quite a bit over the last couple of years. As a white man, I don't think I fully appreciated the gravity of the situation and how deep it ran until, Charlottesville. I have a two-part question for you. Do you think there's a racist undercurrent to now not wanting to legalize cannabis today in 2020? And then we'd love to hear about some of the national conversations that are happening around fixing the wrongs that were created by the war on drugs.
Sure. I think to many of us, it just kind of seems like a foregone conclusion, right? That cannabis ought to be legal, especially, in this day and age, given that we have an overwhelming majority of states that has some form of legal cannabis, and everyone is aware of the vast disparities in terms of imprisonment and prosecution for cannabis crimes. I think that you just kind of have to look at the underlying pretense for so many law enforcement interactions, right? We've kind of that last couple of years has really brought policing into focus more than ever, and so we see time and time again how many of these law enforcement interactions with people of color start. The pretense is, well, they had cannabis, right? They had drugs. They were using drugs. That time and time again, we see that over and over again, and that is, it's not a mystery. It's not shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody who's paying attention. And so, when you think about the types of grave human rights abuses that cannabis prohibition, essentially permits by setting the stage for these law enforcement interactions, you have to wonder what someone's intention is, right? When they oppose cannabis legalization in this day and age. There's always been a racist under for criminalizing cannabis, criminalizing communities who supposedly use cannabis more than others. But now I think more than ever, it's really incumbent upon anyone who's paying attention and who cares about policing to also care about cannabis prohibition. And to understand that the issues are intertwined. In terms of some of the national conversations that are being had, so Betty raised it earlier. There are communities that were targeted by the war on drugs, by cannabis prohibition. That folks who now have arrest records, who've been prosecuted, who have had other harms visited upon them from the war on cannabis, who are essentially disenfranchised from the cannabis industry. The earliest cannabis legalization laws prohibited folks who had arrest records for cannabis from participating in the industry, and that the ultimate irony, right, is that you are targeted and then you can't participate when it becomes legal, and you're maybe still sitting in a jail cell as well. And so that has also come into focus for many states who have initiated, who have developed social equity ordinances, social equity laws that essentially will take those communities who've been disproportionately disenfranchised and harmed by the war on drugs and allow them to participate. Not only allow them to participate, not only doing away with things like felony disqualification, but also setting up programs to actually help them overcome some of the systematic barriers to participating in the cannabis industry. Access to capital being one very large barrier to entry that is very difficult for most communities of color who have been targeted by the war on drugs to get over. And so without the assistance of the state, without the assistance of local municipalities, some of these folks who have been victimized by the war on cannabis are never going to be able to participate in the industry. And so that's what these conversations about social equity are about. It's not just about diversity and inclusion. That's a very important goal in the industry for sure. We want a diverse industry that looks like the consumer base. But that being said, this is about actually righting wrongs. This is actually about addressing the systematic harms that were imposed on these communities. And so it's not just about diversity and inclusion. It's about overcoming the deck that's been stacked against these communities through cannabis prohibition. And so, as a Californian, I'm proud to say that the first social equity laws were originated here in California, in Oakland, Los Angeles, San Francisco. Several other jurisdictions now in California followed suit. We've seen states embrace social equity. So, Illinois has, although they've had some serious problems with implementation, they had what was initially deemed a model for social equity legislation at the state level. Massachusetts, lots of other jurisdictions now that have legal cannabis are also embracing social equity and initiating that conversation and initiating that with industry as well. And I think that's. I don't want to take up too much time at this point, but I would love to talk also about what industry should be doing. But I think that's at a high level, that's the social equity conversation that's happening.
Thanks, Khurshid. Khurshid talked about our duty to right wrongs, and we've talked a lot about government players. And we're seeing some politicians stepping up, not only to deschedule cannabis, but also to make sure that those social equity provisions are included in descheduling legislation. But Betty, to Khurshid's point about the industry, what is the responsibility of the private sector? People that look like me that are making lots of money, what's their responsibility to right some of these wrongs?
I'm going to pick a nit with something that Khurshid said, which doesn't happen often. But he said communities that were being harmed. And we need to be really clear here, not just in places where where cannabis is still illegal, but across the globe, communities are being harmed by the war on drugs, whether or not there is an active policing presence. We know from empirical research that trauma is generated by sudden family separation, by the by the hard scrabble life that can come from economic disenfranchisement, from the experiences of being arrested. And that trauma is epigenetic. It passes from one generation to the next. That trauma is, once generated, it takes a lot of work and intention and resources to be able to diffuse it, to be able to remove it from your family line. We know, based on empirical evidence, that for people in primarily white communities, for primarily white people, it is much easier to retain wealth that is gained. Whereas even for Black and Brown communities, once wealth is gained, it is lost more quickly. And we're seeing in this pandemic a grotesque example of that. So let us not for a moment think that the war on drugs isn't continuing to harm communities. When it comes to child custody and people who are still losing those court battles because they used cannabis and their partner uses it against them, immigration law, employment law, and so many other areas, and just the stigma that still remains. And what we really need to pay close attention to is how do we take a holistic approach to a systemic problem? So I love that, a lot of these modern programs for justice and equity in the cannabis industry, and in fact, being undertaken now by my organization MAPS and the provision of MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD, are really looking at all of the different ways that people are distanced from opportunity and addressing each of them in turn. Are we not just employing people from the neighborhood, not just providing social equity applicants the opportunity to apply for valuable licenses, not just doing this, that, or the other, but really creating a holistic system that creates a guard against all of the many ways that people are, particularly people of color, and especially people of color who have been incarcerated, are disallowed from participating in this modern system. And so I will encourage all of you, if you are cannabis consumers, please make sure that your dispensary, your providers know that it matters to you that they're supporting these initiatives, that it matters to you that they are continuing to participate in building a generative economy, as opposed to further exacerbating the harms of these oppressive systems that we sort of naturally live in, right? So if you're telling your cannabis dispensary that, if you're telling the providers of your favorite edibles or whatever it might be, or if you're making sure that when these laws are passed in your counties, your cities, your states, that they are including an equity initiative, they're including expungement, they're including all of these very critical steps to ensure people are able to build community again, then we're going to create a healthier, safer community for everyone.
Thanks, Betty. I'm going to pivot off a couple things you said. You talked about creating a holistic system, and you're right. Consumers have more power than we realize or know. I mean, look what happened recently with GameStop, right? If consumers can demand change. So thanks for pointing that out. I'm going to ask one more question, then we'll take Q&A. Paloma, as a medical doctor, how would descheduling help doctors and scientists further research, and why is research important? And are there any other reasons why we should make it a priority to deschedule cannabis?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. One of the reasons, physicians are so hesitant to even recommend cannabis to their patients is because there has been barely any research in support the efficacy of cannabis, the dosing of cannabis. In medical school, we're taught to practice evidence-based medicine, which follows stepwise algorithms to really find the correct pharmacological ailment for patient A, B, and C based on age, gender, comorbidities, and other medications. And that research just isn't available to cannabis, and it never will be as a Schedule I substance. And guess what? It's not going to be if we reschedule it to Schedule II, which is why it's so imperative that we deschedule completely. Research is of the utmost importance. Although cannabis has a much larger safety profile compared to many of the other pharmacological agents out there, it's certainly not a panacea. There are certain populations that should avoid it. There are certain drug-drug interactions that physicians really need to be aware of. So having that, again, bringing that back into our medical toolkits to really bring specifically geriatric patients the utmost medical care is of the utmost importance. Let's not forget that the FDA synthesized THC, synthetic THC, which sits on Schedule III today, dronabinol, which has a bevy of side effect profiles. It's approved by the FDA for chemotherapy-related nausea and vomiting. Epidiolex, which is CBD, another component of the cannabis plan, is the Schedule V today. So again, talking about antiquated and frankly inane legislation that puts it up there is really something that we need to combat and continue to do in order to bring evidence-based medicine and research back to physicians, back on the medical school boards in order to really be able to treat our population again.
Thanks, Paloma. There are myriad benefits to descheduling, right? And for me, one of the main reasons is let's get this out of the hands of the DEA, a law enforcement agency, and put it in the hands of a public health agency like the FDA. But from the industry's perspective, also, descheduling fixes this unsustainable federal-state conflict. It fixes 280E. It fixes banking. It makes so much sense for so many reasons and so many people. I'm certainly hoping that we find 10 Republicans to agree. We had a couple questions pop up here. One of them I think was probably most appropriate for John, since he's a professor. And the question is really about language. Should we stop talking about cannabis in terms of marijuana with an H? Should we start educating people and start talking about it as cannabis or something else? Like, is language a problem?
Well, yeah, when I first started the legal space, I was operating under, the street terminology, weed, marijuana, and I was quickly corrected that you can't say marijuana because that was a term that was stamped on by the authorities to demonize the plant. Cannabis, if you Google cannabis in the 1800s, that was the term that was used for medicinal products that was widely used in America. And now we have the term marijuana. I would argue that we should be politically correct when we're talking about it. We should use the term cannabis and we should stick to it so we don't kind of create these very loaded terms that have a lot of meaning behind it.
Well, that seems like a mic drop, but we do have one more question out here. The question is for Paloma. If medical schools aren't educating on cannabis and descheduling finally happens, will medical schools and medical professionals adapt? Like, will they start teaching their patients about cannabis?
Oh, yeah. So I always compare this to, if I'm in medical school, I'm just not going to show up for the 3 months that we're learning about the cardiovascular system. Right? And I make the endocannabinoid system, which is our physiological cannabis system, equatable to the cardiovascular system because it interacts with all our other organ systems in our body. Again, yes, if this is federally legal, it'll exponentially increase the amount of medical schools that are teaching about cannabis today, as it should. This is an adjunct alternative therapy. And as we get sicker, as we have our largest growing demographic be the elderly, it is the utmost importance that we incorporate this plant-based medicine back into our medical toolkits in order to really heal people that are suffering from so many different epidemics in the United States right now.
I think it looks like we have time for one more question for Betty. And then I think we probably have to wrap because we're a little bit over time here. Before I ask this question to Betty, I just want to say, I said this at the outstart, but this is really like a dream team panel here, particularly on this issue, but kudos to you guys. So Betty, the question is about NIDA and research. What is happening at NIDA? And this is, Paloma and I have talked about this quite a bit. Like it infuriates me that we live in a country with the best universities in the world. Mm-hmm. And we're taking a backseat to Uruguay and Germany and Israel on research. It's just BS, man. We should be leading this. So
there are so many things to be upset about in our healthcare research systems right now and healthcare provision systems, Andrew, but this is one that's really incredibly aggravating. All right, so how many of you believe that MDMA is a harder drug than cannabis or marijuana? Raise your hand. All right, drop your hand, because in fact, we should not use the term harder drug. It's very stigmatizing, and it does not accurately represent the harms or risks of these drugs, most of which can be used safely in appropriate settings with appropriate amounts if we actually know what we're getting, which we don't. And that's the whole problem with NIDA. So the National Institute on Drug Abuse gets to be in charge of who gets to grow cannabis for research studies in the United States. Right now, my organization is ushering through the last phase 3 randomized controlled clinical trial for the use of MDMA, a supposedly harder drug, but a more stigmatized drug than cannabis or marijuana. And we are unable to conduct a single randomized clinical trial on cannabis because NIDA only allows the University of Mississippi to produce cannabis, and the DEA in cahoots with NIDA, and it's been an incredible mess for many, many years. For 20 years, we've been fighting this, if not longer. And the cannabis that is produced out of that facility is of such poor quality, it in no way represents the cannabis that is available in your local dispensary or from your local drug seller or from your local cultivator, your local home grower. It in no way represents it. It is oftentimes found to be polluted with mold, with various pollutants, and it is unable. They're unable to produce a product that can be routinely similar enough to be tested as if it were a medical product. And that's what doctors are looking for. They want to know, hey, what do I write a dose out for? I can't write a dose for like 1 joint a day. That doesn't fit with a physician's natural inclination. So much easier to just not learn about it, right? We're really creating a false barrier between greater knowledge, greater opportunity to heal, greater opportunity to give people the power to heal themselves by not allowing research to continue. And there are some exciting movements happening here. There's a lawsuit that we hope will very soon result in the issuance of 30 some odd licenses as per a DEA administrative judge ruling that happened, I don't know what, like 6 years ago or something, ages. It's long past time for us to be able to properly test and assay cannabis and know truly, can it help with these conditions?
Yeah, I'll just give a shout out to Shane Pennington and Matt Zorn from Shane Pennington is now with Vicente Cederberg and Matt Zorn with Yetter Coleman in Houston because they've been using, you've got 3 lawyers on the panel here today and a medical doctor. And, these lawyers have been using the legal tools to and the courts to sue the DEA to get results. And it's really important work, really, really, really important work. Thank you, everyone. This has been really educational for me, I got to say. So I'm sure that it was educational for the folks listening in. Really appreciate you guys joining and appreciate you generally.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Andrew. Thanks, Willis.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, guys.